Sherlock Holmes. The sudden death of Cardinal Tosca.
A quotation from The Adventure of Black Peter, July 1895.
In this memorable year 95, a curious and incongruous succession of cases had engaged his attention, ranging from his famous investigation of the sudden death of Cardinal Tosca, an inquiry which was carried out by him at the express desire of His Holiness the Pope. Chapter 1. It is years ago that the astonishing incidents occurred which I want to report today, and even now I hesitate to mention them. For a long time, it was impossible to publish the facts, even using extreme discretion and restraint. Now that relationships between the Catholic and the Anglican Church have been deeply disturbed through the Pope's apostolic letter Apostolici Curiae and its rebuttal by the Archbishop of Canterbury's liturgical history argumentation in Sepius Officio, the story can be told because things could not possibly get worse. In all our cases, it happened again and again that Holmes was commissioned by the highest political circles. The gentry and even the military were looking for his support. Yet this case was different because the Church required his help, allowing Holmes, with his sensitive respect for the dignity of these institutions, to track down a case that required, how shall we say, an approach which offered Holmes an appropriate framework for applying his incomparable skill. The Pope was in London in the spring of 1885. The papers were full of news about the Pope and his clerical representative in London, Cardinal Tosca. I was resting in Holmes's sitting room. While he played his violin, I read with interest the news about these important meetings which excited all of London in those days up to the highest political circles. In the phase of strained relations, these two most powerful churches on the globe were trying to reshape their relationship. Holmes was far away from all politics that evening. He had caught himself in the realm of his violin, for he was an excellent player and an enthusiastic musician. In those moments of his playing, he was cloaked in a perfect feeling of bliss. His enraptured, dreamy eyes showed how much pleasure he felt in this poetic and contemplative mood. We were interrupted. I am reading my newspaper, and Holmes in his playing of the violin, by the noise of a carriage that had stopped below on Baker Street, and by the impatient ringing of our doorbell. Then we heard hasty steps on the stairs. Slowly Holmes returned to our world. His eyes regained their usual acuity, and his mind prepared him to pay attention to another great task. Quite obviously, the man who stood before us now in our room was a high-ranking clergyman. He was a minister of the Catholic Church, red in his face from the strains of his hurry, with a desperate expression. Aimlessly he walked through our room, avoiding to come too close to either of us, as if he were unsure whether he should dare to do for what he had entered our home so boldly and disruptively. "It is no longer necessary to invite you in," Holmes said, while he calmly and carefully stowed away his violin in its case. "You have already taken that upon yourself, so please have a seat. I will be with you in a moment." Holmes reached for his pipe, stuffed and lit it while he slowly turned to our guest. Thus reminded of the rules of courtesy, our guest stood there embarrassed and hesitant between the chairs in front of the fireplace. He seemed somewhat uncertain about his own behaviour, yet driven by the events which he wanted to relate. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my friend Dr. Watson. With whom do we have the pleasure?" Holmes tried to get the conversation going. "You may address me as Cardinal Silvano. I have come to London from the Vatican as a representative of the Pope with an entourage of negotiators. I speak in the Pope's name when I ask you for your help in a matter of extreme urgency, and please, discretion." I was still not used to the fact that Holmes's reputation all over Europe was so outstanding that there was no one of rank and name who didn't know that my friend Sherlock Holmes was the first call for help and support in the most delicate of all delicate cases. In these years after the death of Professor Moriarty, it was almost an exercise I might call regular, but I must say that I still had difficulty getting used to these new developments, since my memories of Baker Street were connected with the homely bachelor flat where we had spent our time together. Holmes understood there would be no hope for a quiet conversation. Our visitor was too excited. Holmes also stood still, studied our guest, and asked, "Tell me, Cardinal Silvano, what bothers you? How can I be of help?" "Here in London," Cardinal Silvano began, "the Catholic Church is represented by Cardinal Tosca. The Cardinal prepared our meetings with the Anglican Church, represented by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the most important man in our entourage, an outstanding authority on the local situation, honoured and respected by all partners to the negotiations, a man of the Church of excellent reputation." Holmes was leaning against a bookcase, his arms folded across the chest, listening intently to the Cardinal's remarks. His nodding encouraged the Cardinal to continue. Today's talks finally resulted in the first convergence between the diverging positions of the Pope and those of the Archbishop. It is not an exaggeration to say that Cardinal Tosca's talent to respond to his partners in conversation, to move them and to make them appreciate the opposite view was a major contribution to our success. At the end of our talks today, the Cardinal left us to return to his residence. However, since the Pope saw a need for further talks, he sent me to ask the Cardinal to assist the Pope once again tonight. I called for our carriage and went to the Cardinal's residence. When we arrived, we drove into the courtyard, left the carriage and went to the front door. Since no one responded to our rapping, I tried to open the door. It was unlocked, and we found a way upstairs to the Cardinal's parlour. Cardinal Silvano stopped in telling his story.
Do go on,
Holmes urged him. Holmes's face had long lost the soft expression of the gifted musician and violin virtuoso. His countenance reflected tension and brightness. He was an aroused hunter who eagerly followed a new scent. In that room we found the butler of the house. He stood in front of a sofa, completely at a loss. Holmes lowered his head. It seemed that he wanted to lip read the Cardinal, watching closely as he formed every word. Sitting or actually lying on the sofa was Cardinal Tosca. Dead, obviously. The butler had only just found him. I immediately sounded the alarm, sending my companions to the street. They soon found a constable who called others. The courtyard and the house were secured. The search for the killer began.
kill him.
Do you have reason to believe that it was murder? Our client's embarrassment grew immensely.
Mr.
Holmes, how can I express myself? The Vatican is one of the world's greatest centers of power. Influencing it, you stopped in mid-sentence. It is absolutely necessary to solve this case without leaving the slightest doubt and to come to a conclusion that allows us with all discretion to recognize any dangers so we can eliminate them.
I want to emphasize that I had accompanied the Cardinal to his residence myself just an hour earlier.
He was a healthy, strong man. I cannot think of any other way in which he could have lost his life. Chapter 2. It was not long before we sat in the papal carriage driving through late hour London to the Cardinal's residence. The streets were already empty, and we made quick progress. It was becoming quiet inside the houses. The city began to be sleepy. On Waterloo Bridge, we crossed the big river with its sluggish traffic of barges. Finally, we reached
Borough Road, the destination of our short ride.
Here we encountered quite a different sight in the street. There were constables everywhere, searching houses, blocking entranceways, checking pedestrians. As we arrived at the Cardinal's residence, we were stopped at the gate. Even the Vatican coats of arms on the carriage, the stately horses, and the persuasive words by the coachman were unable to convince the constable at the gate. Only when Holmes left the carriage, his well-known appearance produced respect and admiration in the constable's face. He stepped aside and asked us to enter the courtyard. Holmes followed us on foot, deep in thought as he took in the yard and the building, prepared to see and absorb everything that could be of importance in this case. We all left the carriage. Waiting to see what Holmes would do, we did not hurry directly into the house, but stayed with the carriage. Holmes stood in the middle of the courtyard assessing the property, his face in deep thought. The Cardinal's 3-story residence had a 1-story annex housing staff quarters and utility rooms. To this, a stable had been added later.
Stairs led up to the raised front entrance which resembled a portal.
Since it was already dark, Holmes did not further examine the ground and entered the building together with us. The constable guarding the entrance door took us up one flight of stairs to the Cardinal's parlour. There were 2 people standing in the room. One was Inspector Lestrade, whom we knew from many other cases. The other was the butler. Lestrade approached us surprised, but still happy to see us. We all shook hands. Holmes, how did you hear about this case? This Cardinal here asked us to come on behalf of the Pope. Holmes pointed to Cardinal Silvano. But Lestrade, is this really a case?
I'll gladly give you an opportunity to judge.
Lestrade stood aside, allowing us to look at the room. It was a spacious, well-furnished parlour with a large window front and 2 doors. We had just entered the room through one door, the other door was closed. One of the windows stood open. On the sofa, in half-recumbent position, we saw Cardinal Tosca, or rather his remains. Holmes approached the table on which stood an empty glass. Its rim had traces showing that someone had been drinking from it. Without touching it, Holmes smelled it and raised his eyes meaningfully. He carefully bent over to the Cardinal's face, where he also inhaled.
I found this behaviour of Holmes disconcerting, especially since the Cardinal had been such a highly respected person in life, but Holmes seemed to be quite satisfied with the result of this strange examination.
A constable entering the room interrupted Holmes in his concentration. The constable reported to Lestrade that the immediate neighbourhood had been searched, and no suspicious persons were found. Holmes wrinkled his brow. I couldn't tell whether it was due to the interruption or the message. What do you think, Holmes? Lestrade asked. Is there a reason for keeping my men here? Especially in view of the fact that Cardinal Silvano asked for a discreet investigation. I don't see any reason to deprive your men of their well-earned rest any longer, Holmes answered quietly, thoughtfully, letting his eyes wander over the dead Cardinal. In view of this obvious criticism, Lestrade was a bit displeased. Surely you will realize, Holmes, that as the inspector responsible for this case, it is not that easy for me to satisfy all wishes. After all, there are regulations, even though it seems you submit to them rather seldom. That is a privilege my profession is granting me, Holmes said with a smile. Lestrade dismissed the constable, ordering him to discontinue the search and let his men go. The somewhat lofty manner of Holmes has often led to minor disagreements with the investigating inspectors. Although Holmes never allowed these to escalate, he always insisted there would be no doubt that his methods differed from those of the police. Chapter 3. After the constables had left, the atmosphere in the house and in the yard of the residence calmed down considerably. Now the quiet of the evening could extend to this place as well. Surely Holmes appreciated that. He preferred it when his mind could develop without hindrance and in peace. Who entered the house this evening? Holmes turned to the butler.
No one, sir.
Only the Cardinal himself after he returned early in the evening. And the staff? There have been no visitors. Holmes nodded, contemplating. So the killer must have found another way to enter than through the door and up the stairs. I think he must have come through the open window, the butler speculated. Certainly, Holmes said, that seems obvious. Shall I bring the gentleman some tea? The butler asked, remembering his actual calling. I accepted the offer enthusiastically. I knew from experience it would take some time for Holmes to conclude his investigation. Although I always enjoyed watching Holmes at work, a good cup of tea would shorten the time most pleasantly. As I had expected, Holmes now turned to the window. Just as the butler did, I also thought that was the obvious escape route for the killer. There one would expect some traces leading to important clues. With his usual thoroughness, Holmes inspected the casing and the window's locking mechanism. In deep thought, he looked down into the courtyard for a long time. The closures of these windows are very easy to open, also from the outside, he remarked.
We have examined the courtyard, Lestrade said.
There is all kinds of gear in the back of the outbuilding, including a ladder which might have been used. The courtyard is paved. The window sill is of stone. Unfortunately, we won't find any evidence there, Holmes said, responding to Lestrade's comments. He put his magnifying glass back in his pocket. For a moment, he looked out the window, pondering something. What do you think about the cause of death, Lestrade? He turned to the Scotland Yard inspector. Poison, without a doubt. The bittersweet odour of almonds is on the glass as well as on the body. As soon as we are done here, we will remove the corpse and have it examined. Holmes nodded in agreement, but contemplatively. The cause of death is very obvious. Every layman would think so. Where does this door go? Holmes turned to Lestrade.
This door goes to the Cardinal's bedroom.
Holmes took 2 or 3 steps toward the door to continue his investigation there, but he was interrupted by Lestrade's remark, the door is locked.
Holmes stopped short and turned around in surprise.
Where is the key? It hasn't been ascertained so far. The butler says it is normally on the inside. He has already been told to get the duplicate key. I assume it isn't essential. The Cardinal's death obviously occurred in this room. Slowly, Holmes approached the door. He carefully looked at the carpet and the floor in front of it. Finally, he went down on his knees at the door, placed his eye over the keyhole to catch a glance at the inside of the room. I noticed how he startled and then turned his head to look over the parlour again. He took a deep breath.
I understood that Holmes tried to sort out the odours in the building, and I copied him.
But from where I stood, I could not discern any smell of almonds. I was too far away from the glasses and the body. To me, there were no suspicious odours. Chapter 4. Hesitatingly, Holmes stood up and walked 2 or 3 steps away from the door back toward the sofa, when finally the housekeeper appeared with tea on a tray. This excellent woman had been in the Cardinal's service for a long time. Although she should have known that she would see the dead man in this room, the sight of him proved too much for her. She only managed a few steps inside the room, and when she saw the body, she gave an outcry and fainted. The silver tray with the cups and the teapot dropped to the floor with a loud clattering of shards. Poor Sherlock Holmes. His brilliant mind, the acuity of his intellect and his abilities to find solutions, even in hopeless situations, stood in marked contrast to his lack of empathy, especially for members of the opposite sex. While Lestrade and I hurried to help the woman, Holmes looked at the scene with strange fascination. He stood directly next to the housekeeper, but he did not bend down to her. He stood there with his head bowed, looking at the chaos of broken teacups, sugar, and the tray as if he could find the solution of this murder case from all of it. Only when Lestrade and I had lifted the poor woman into an armchair, Holmes kneeled on the floor playing with the silver tray. He inspected it closely and in deep thought, holding it still in his hand. Finally he dropped it and stood up impatiently. I have been working with Holmes for many years. I know his expressions, his mimicry and his gestures. It was clear to me that he had found a special significance in this scene. Yet as much as I tried, I was unable to find a connection between the dead cardinal and the spilled tea. Restlessly, Holmes shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Finally, he turned impatiently to Lestrade. Come on, leave this housekeeper alone. Nothing has happened, and surely, Doctor Watson will devote himself to her. After all, that's his profession. I knew this kind of behaviour in Holmes. As a racehorse impatiently paws the ground with its hoofs, Holmes was rearing to go. He knew what he wanted, but he had stumbled across something that prevented him from implementing what his brilliant mind had already established. Yet he remained silent with restraint and self-control. A maid came, alarmed by the noise of the fallen tray. She removed the shards and all the chaos caused by this incident. Holmes sat in an armchair across from the housekeeper, his elbows on the armrests, his fingertips pressed together. With his eyes half closed, he gave the impression of a tight spring just waiting to be released and to snap open. What was it that made him so restless? I tried to unobtrusively observe the housekeeper. She recovered quickly. I had held a little bottle of smelling salt under her nose, and it had brought her back to consciousness. Chapter 5. Shortly after, the butler came back as well. He had not only made the housekeeper bring tea, but also looked for the duplicate key to the cardinal's bedroom. At Lestrade's request, he put the key in the lock and turned it. The door opened into the parlour. He stepped aside to let Lestrade enter, who had already come close, showing great interest. We could look into the room. Obviously no one was there. Holmes had also slowly stood up. The three of us went into the bedroom. Holmes let me go in before him, and he was the last to enter. I heard Holmes asking the butler to follow us into the room. It was furnished the way one would expect it of a bedroom, with a bed, a side table, wardrobes, and bookcases. The fire in the fireplace gave the room a soft light. The window was closed. While Lestrade examined the room, opening all the wardrobes and even looking under the bed, I looked out the window and tried to see something in the dark. It had begun to rain in the meantime. Hard rain splashed against the window, making it impossible to recognize anything outside. Only Holmes remained standing in front of a bookcase, reading the titles of the books with interest. Suddenly he turned to the butler with a satisfied expression. Please, would you stand on a chair and pass me the book with the light cover from the top shelf? The butler went to the side table, took one of the chairs and set it in front of the bookcase. He stood on the chair and reached for the book Holmes had pointed out. Stop. Holmes called. Take a cloth between your fingers so not to raise any fingerprints. It has been discovered recently that the fingerprints of two persons are never alike, and that a perpetrator can be identified with certainty by identifying his fingerprints. Only last year, in the case of the Nord builder, Holmes and Lestrade had experienced this, even though Lestrade fell victim to a deceptive maneuver by Jonas Oldecker. Holmes, however, had seen through it and thwarted it. The butler stopped to pull a handkerchief from his waistcoat. Holmes directed him to the book he had identified as important. He took his own handkerchief to accept the book. Yet so closely did he follow every movement of the butler that the cloth slipped from his hand and fell on the chair on which the butler stood. Holmes picked it up and then took the book. Holmes turned toward Lestrade, the book in his hand. He read the title aloud, which was written in large letters on the cover of Poisons and Their Effect on the Body. What do you think of that, Lestrade? He asked. He went to the side table and laid the book on it. Could we have an indication of suicide here? Lestrade wondered. It isn't out of the question, I think, Holmes replied. The bedroom was no longer of interest to Holmes now. To avoid having to look at the body, We went downstairs to the fireside lounge, where Holmes and Lestrade questioned the butler on whether there had been any signs that the Cardinal might have contemplated suicide. When the questioning was finally over, it was late, and the rain continued whipping against their house. Since Cardinal Silvano also had left the house long ago, Holmes asked the butler whether he could be taken home in the carriage of the residence. The butler was visibly embarrassed to say that the carriage had a damaged straw bar and wasn't available. But he sent a boy to fetch a cab, and soon there was nothing to prevent us from returning home. Chapter 6. The bad weather made for an unpleasant cab ride. I was glad to have decided to move back to Baker Street.
What would have been better suited to set against the forced changes in my life with courage and determination than to face fate on the side of Sherlock Holmes?
After this strenuous evening, I was happy to go to bed. But Holmes sat down at his acid-jarred pine table and seemed to prepare some chemical analyzers. The last I saw before going to bed was that Holmes intensely examined the handkerchief with which he had handled the book about poison. What clues could he possibly find there? Next morning, Holmes woke me up early. He was obviously in a good mood. His investigations last night must have had some results, and he was now eager to return to the scene once again. As was often the case, Holmes remained silent, and I did not question him. He would find the right time to inform me. We took a cab to go to the Cardinal's residence again. The trees were still dripping from the heavy rain of last night, but the awakening sun was beginning to dry the streets and the walls of the houses. We left the cab outside the entrance to the courtyard and walked through the gate into the walled area of the residence. As we entered the courtyard, Holmes glanced to the side at the sandy ground in front of the stable. "Holmes," I said, "do you really believe there could be even a tiny trace left after yesterday's thunderstorm?" "Nothing about anything that happened before the rain," Holmes answered, "but about what happened after." He pointed at the sandy ground in front of the stable gate. Clearly there were the tracks of a one-horse carriage. Through a crack, Holmes peeked into the stable. "Where does a carriage come from in the middle of the night after the big rain?" "Look, Watson." He waved me to come and let me look into the stable. "There is a carriage in the stable. The carriage of the Cardinal, as you can see from the decorations and the lettering." "But didn't the butler say the carriage had a damaged straw bar?" "It seems," Holmes said with a mysterious smile on his lips, "that the carriage was still repaired in the night. It is back in its place. According to the tracks out here, it seems to be in good order. Stand on guard for a moment, Watson." Having said that, he slid through the door into the stable. I looked around nervously to see whether anyone was observing us. Very soon Holmes was back. He showed me his fingers on which was rat sand. "I have this sand from the wheels of the carriage," he said. "It was this carriage that left the tracks in the wet sand here." Chapter 7. "Hello, what are you doing there? And who are you anyway?" The woman who called to us stood in front of the annex with the staff quarters and the kitchen. She was holding a scrub pail. Judging by her dress, she was the cook of the residence. Holmes went over to her and introduced himself. "You're the cook of the house?" he asked. When she confirmed it, Holmes wondered about the scrub pail she was holding. "Yes," the cook said. "After all, someone has to clean up the water that came through the roof in the night." "Oh," said Holmes, "you have a leaking roof." "It wasn't leaking yesterday. Must have been damaged during the storm in the night. When I came into the kitchen this morning, there was water on the floor." Holmes gave a knowing nod. He said bye to the woman and pulled me round the corner to the back of the building. In passing, he closely inspected the gutter. "What are you looking for, Holmes? Surely you don't plan to earn extra money by repairing roofs?" "In fact, Watson, I am looking for broken roof tiles. Perhaps we find a reason for the rainwater in the kitchen. Perhaps we find more there. Oh, look at this." Holmes pointed to the gutter that was kinked in one spot. In the back of the house, the roof was quite low. I held my hands for Holmes to step on them. He could stand high enough to have a look into the gutter. When he tried to hold on to it, though, it gave way a bit and water gushed to the ground from it, missing me by a hair. "There it is, Watson." Holmes called out and jumped back to the ground. He bent down and picked up a piece of wood the water had flushed out of the gutter. In his other hand he held a piece of broken tile he had found on the roof. I had expected we would go back into the house to look around some more in the Cardinal's bedroom. I was still thinking of the book about poison. There could be traces of poison in the house which Holmes might want to find. "What do you want to do with a broken roof tile?" I asked him. "Do you recall that last night I still did some chemical analyzers? I want to compare this with yesterday's results." If I remember correctly, Holmes, you examined your handkerchief. Why do you want to compare your handkerchief with the roof tiles? Don't forget that my handkerchief had slipped from my hands.
Holmes loved dropping this kind of hint.
I understood that he had probably solved the puzzle. He might still be missing one or two details, but even now he had determined to be on the right track. And what about that wood? We looked at it more closely. It was a small piece of flat, polished and lacquered wood with an engraving that showed part of an aristocratic coat of arms. What do you think of it, Watson?
Holmes turned to me.
I took the little piece of wood in my hand, turning it back and forth. It could be a piece from a walking stick, I pondered. You should know this kind of bric-a-brac better than I, Watson. You're the one who was married. I couldn't make anything of his remark. Sure, I had been living in a marriage for several years, but what should a piece of wood from an eaves trough have to do with the staid married life of a medical doctor?
Puzzled, I looked at Holmes, hoping he would let me take part in the solution of this mystery.
Let's return to Baker Street, Watson. I think Whittaker's almanac will serve us well once again.
Chapter 8.
We returned to Baker Street together. Holmes's chemical analyses and our joint efforts to identify the coat of arms took some time. Then Holmes went to his chamber and came back as elegantly dressed as if he were planning to go attend a concert performance. I still have to clarify a small matter, Watson, before the mystery of the Cardinal's death is completely solved. I suggest we meet here again for supper. As usual, M.S. Hudson will do some splendid cooking, and then we can bring this case to its conclusion together.
Please ask Lestrade and Cardinal Silvano to be here at 8 o'clock sharp.
I'm sure they won't deprive us the pleasure. Inspired by the joyful expectation of having the case solved, I was glad to accept Holmes's invitation and went to deliver the messages. I regarded it as a bit of an honour to pay a visit to Scotland Yard and also to be admitted to meet the Pope's entourage. When I returned to Baker Street at 8, the magnificent carriage of Cardinal Silvano already stood in front of the door to our modest abode. Lestrade arrived a few minutes later, and soon the four of us were assembled at the table. The Cardinal, who had never dealt with Holmes before, was nervous and impatient to learn about the promised solution of the case. Lestrade, whom Holmes had often helped when it was a matter of solving difficult cases, already knew about Holmes's preference to develop the solution of a case quietly and thoroughly over a good meal and a good glass of sherry. He was therefore prepared to be very patient. Say, Lestrade, Holmes brought the conversation to the subject for which we had all been assembled here. What has your examination of the poison brought to light, which you presume was Cardinal Tosca's cause of death? It must be a new kind of poison that evaporates quickly, Holmes. We have all smelled that it had been in the glass as well as on the dead Cardinal. However, our examination in the forensic laboratory did not reveal any trace of it on the fabric or in the blood. It is also possible that some gas was involved, in which case detection would be even more difficult. That's it. I shouted in excitement. What do you mean, Watson? Holmes turned to face me. I saw how you inhaled the air before we entered the bedroom. You were trying to trace the gas. Watson, if gas had really been in the air, we would all be dead now instead of being able to enjoy M.S. Hudson's excellent meal. As he said this, he again took delight in another mouthful of lamb in mint sauce. Could it be, Holmes asked, turning toward Lestrade, that it was not a case of murder by poison? And Cardinal, Holmes continued, what exactly did you find when you first entered Cardinal Tosca's room? Who voiced the suspicion of murder first? You or the butler? When I think of it clearly, it was I, the Cardinal answered. I immediately called the police since the consequences of the situation immediately occurred to me. And how did the butler react? The butler was as confused and frightened as was to be expected in this situation. He had just found his dead master on the sofa.
Lestrade impatiently interrupted this exchange.
What could it have been other than murder by poison, Holmes? I'm thinking of a feigned murder by poison. As he said this, Holmes laid the fork down, sat his elbows on the table, and watched us across his folded hands on which his chin rested. Why on earth should anyone feign a murder of the Cardinal by poison? To provide an explanation. In anticipation, we stared at Holmes. I will reveal to you my chain of evidence. When we entered the Cardinal's parlour, I realised from the Cardinal's location and position that there was definitely no indication of murder by poison. Over the years, I have seen many dead bodies, some of them victims of murder by poison. I have carefully investigated and observed all kinds of post-mortal body positions and with what cause of death they can be connected. The position in which the Cardinal's body was found was completely atypical for a murder by poison. It even seemed to me that the Cardinal had been taken to the sofa afterwards. Now it was a matter of finding out what had really happened and where the Cardinal had really died. This opening seemed monstrous and breathtaking to us all. We continued looking at Holmes with intense excitement. Last night, Holmes continued, a locked bedroom door caught my particular interest. How could this key have been lost? Who could have locked the door and why? I knew as well that the bedroom was important. Lestrade interrupted him. But it was you, Holmes, who didn't bother examining it when we were finally able to enter it. Holmes gave a malicious smile. At that point, I was already following a completely different trail, that of the red tile dust on the butler's shoes. Lestrade and I looked at each other in astonishment. I had seen no tile dust on the butler's shoes. I began to suspect that Holmes thought the butler had climbed on the roof. I still could not see a motive for it. Holmes must be wrong about that. Better I tell you the story in sequence. When we entered the Cardinal's parlour, we first paid attention to the sofa where the dead Cardinal reclined and to the open window. However, the open window showed no clues, and the pavement in the courtyard made it unlikely that we could expect any kind of help there. But quite quickly my attention turned to the door leading to the bedroom. In spite of the locked door, I wanted to take a look inside. When I brought my eye to the keyhole, I noticed that there was a strong draught coming through it. I turned my head and saw that the fringes of the carpet were moving in the draught coming into the parlour from under the door. I also noticed a smell of almonds again, drifting into the parlour from the bedroom as a result of the draught. Yet it was remarkable that the draught was not strong enough to lift up the fringes and to flip them over. They only fluttered a bit. Still some fringes were bent backwards lying on the carpet. But the window in the bedroom was closed. Where could the draught have come from? I would say that the window was open at that time. The window hardware is so simple that it can be manipulated easily from the inside and from the outside. It would therefore be possible that someone was in the room and had left it through that window. That would have happened while we were in the parlour, I exclaimed in surprise. Holmes nodded in agreement. Surely you noticed that the butler was not in the room during that part of our observations. But the butler had been in the room with us before. Why should he afterwards climb on the roof and open the window? Unless he had an accomplice in the room whom he wanted to release. It would mean that the butler was an accomplice of the murderer. Holmes looked at me for a moment and then continued. It was at that moment that the housekeeper came into the parlour with the tea and fainted when she saw the poor Cardinal. The tray she dropped was of brightly polished silver. If you are used to observing things carefully, you recognize that a lot of things can be reflected in such a tray. At that moment, I stood with the back toward the bedroom door, but thanks to the slant of the tray that lay on the floor, I had a look under the crack of the door. I couldn't recognize anything distinct, but I saw that a shadow was moving to that side of the room, whereas I later realized the window was. I held my breath. So then the murderer was still in the house. Why didn't you say anything, Holmes? Well, Holmes said, because it seemed to be very small, graceful feet that I spotted in the bedroom. But let me continue. The butler appeared and now finally had the key with him, which he called the duplicate key. He opened the door and let us enter before him. I was holding back, entered as the last man and turned around again. I saw the butler use his shoe to straighten out the fringes of the carpet. That is nothing extraordinary, Holmes. That is his job. Right, Watson. However, I also noticed that the fringes took on a reddish tinge. That is why I asked the butler to stand on a chair and to pass me a book. That is how I could feign the incident with which I could obtain some dust from the butler's shoes to my handkerchief. Holmes's bag of tricks is bottomless. I could recall the scene clearly. Holmes's handkerchief hadn't dropped by accident. It fell on the chair, and that is how Holmes could swipe the butler's shoes and pick up the dust from the tips of the shoes. I had a suspicion that the butler must have been climbing around on the roof. This suspicion hardened on the following day. The roof showed damage and caused rainwater to enter the house, giving the poor cook additional work in the clean-up. The roof is strong enough for a person to walk on it without causing damage. Otherwise, the chimneys couldn't be cleaned. But what would happen if a very heavy person would walk on it? Or a person carrying another person? Do you think there was another dead body in the bedroom? I asked, surprised by what I heard. Not a dead body, but someone who was unable to flee across the roof alone due to that person's shoes and clothing. We were all holding our breath in suspense. The two of us, Watson and I, found not only parts of the broken roof tiles in the eaves trough, but also a piece of finely worked wood with part of a coat of arms on it.
That piece belonged to a lady's fan.
The coat of arms gave me the right indication of the right lady.
That is impossible, Holmes, I exclaimed.
What would a lady have done in a cardinal's bedroom?
Watson. Both Holmes and Lestrade shouted in unison, looking at me in shock.
I didn't dare to look in the direction of Cardinal Silvano.
Chapter 9.
The rest of the story is easily told. The cardinal suffered a heart attack that evening. The loyal servants knew that a police investigation would be unavoidable, so the butler dragged the dead cardinal to the parlour, arranged his body on the sofa in a way a careless observer might think that death had come to him there. The reputation of the cardinal, and thus the good name of the Catholic Church, had to be protected. Of course, the almond smell on the glass and the lips of the cardinal came from the lady who, thanks to the butler, quickly disappeared over the roof of the annex, where the butler probably carried her as soon as the great deployment of police had gone, which Cardinal Silvano had called to the scene. The heavy rain helped in making the search for evidence difficult, allowing the lady to escape without being recognized. Gradually, I understood the connection.
The loyal butler had taken the dead cardinal to the sofa and laid him out there.
Unfortunately, that was precisely the moment when Cardinal Silvano entered the room to pick Cardinal Tosca up. The unexpected appearance of Cardinal Silvano at the wrong moment led to the hasty suspicion of murder by poison.
The magnitude of the investigation that suddenly erupted at the residence had the effect that to the staff, and in particular to the butler,
The suspicion of murder by poison seemed like a promising way out of an embarrassing situation. There would be an unknown murderer, and no one would ever discover how the cardinal had in fact lost his life. Holmes was silent for a moment. In view of this surprising development, we were all quite stunned. Holmes had stood up and walked to the window. As he looked across the roofs of the city, we heard a carriage coming to a halt below. Before turning around again, Holmes said, "It has probably happened before that a crime was presented as a natural death. But the other way round, that a natural death was masked as a crime, must surely be unique in the criminal history of London."
Having come to the end of his report, Holmes remained silent.
To the horror of Cardinal Silvano, Lestrade began to ask now as to who this lady was. Holmes interrupted him. "Unfortunately, I cannot tell you that." He went to the door leading to the other room and opened it. A veiled lady came out. Holmes took her to the stairs and said farewell to her. We still heard the steps on the stairs, the closing of the front door, and the sound of the carriage leaving. None of us went to the window.